Protesters demand food and clean water during lockdown in Bolivia as the country remembers victims of the Zacapa massacre. Brazil's health minister resigns after serving for less than a month. And South Africa's ANC commends the solidarity and contribution of Cuba to the liberation struggle of African nations.
Ideas about the significance of human.
Hello and welcome to Telesur English. I am Estefania Bravo in Quito, Ecuador. This is from the South. Hundreds of Cochabamba residents in central Bolivia have protested against the government for failing to fulfill its promise to provide food and clean water during the lockdown. The protesters, who started demonstrating on Monday, demanded the resignation of the de facto president Janine Áñez and her government minister Arturo Murillo. They also called for the quarantine decree over the coronavirus to be lifted.
The more enclosed we are in our homes, the more we consume water, food, all the things in the house, the more we consume energy as well.
The people are really asking for urgent attention. We are human beings. As I will repeat once again, we are not in hungercracy, we are in democracy.
Bolivians are remembering the day 6 months ago when 9 people were killed by security forces during the Zacapa massacre as they demonstrated in rejection of the coup. More in this report by my colleague Camila Escalante.
It's been 6 months since the November 15th massacre in Zacapa, the first massacre committed by the coup regime. On that day, citizens arrived in a peaceful demonstration to Zacapa, demanding the return of the government of Evo Morales and rejecting the coup which had just taken place. Nine people were killed. Many people turned up injured at hospitals in Zacapa and in the city of Cochabamba with serious injuries. The numerous testimonies received by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights are consistent in indicating that the protesters were unarmed. They were advancing peacefully on their own initiative and were suddenly assaulted with firearms, tear gas containers, batons, and other weapons. Police helicopters participated in the operation, as witnessed by the Cochabamba police commander himself before the commission. Quote, in the Commission's opinion, these events can be characterized as massacres, given the number of people who have lost their lives in the same way, place, and time, and because they were committed against a specific group of people. In addition, the patterns of injuries that have been recorded offer serious indications of extrajudicial execution practices. Residents took me to the sites of several killings by the military and police, including the roads, which remained blocked where the massacre took place.
Castellano puedes, compañero?
Aquí primero la entrada, aquí ha traspasado. Y uno ha pasado por aquí raspamos.
I was there on November 25th as relatives of the massacred in Zacapa presented the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights experts with bullets upon their very brief visit as evidence of the massacre. Media and human rights groups have done little in the way of documenting this evidence.
They were killed like animals, like some dogs. All of them were killed by bullet wounds. We want justice.
I'm also seeking justice for my husband. He was killed here by bullet wound. They had come to defend democracy.
Those peaceful protesters executed by regime security forces for calling for the restoration of Bolivian democracy are regarded as martyrs. Camila Escalante, Telesur in Quito.
And staying in Bolivia, workers at a textile company in the city of El Alto were laid off this week, despite a decree by the de facto government that allegedly prohibited such acts during the COVID-19 crisis. Let's have a look at their story.
Just like another day, on Monday the company sent vehicles to pick up workers. But once they arrived to the factory, they were met by closed doors and the news they had all been laid off.
They say they are willing to pay for our benefits, but we don't want that. What we want is our jobs back. We want to be back at work, for the factory to reopen, because what they have done is illegal.
Workers expected the layoffs, although bosses tried to deceive them.
They forced me to sign my voluntary retirement, but I went to work. We need our jobs.
Alti Fiber has existed for nearly 3 decades. Its products are exported to Europe and China.
We stuck with the company through good and bad, during strikes and protests. We've walked to work. We even came during the crisis, risking our health.
The company can move forward, but they don't want us. They took our jobs, but we won't allow it.
The workers have set up tents on the street and are banding together for a soup kitchen, hoping that the company will reopen its doors.
We need the work. We are parents. We have families. I've worked here for 12 years. It's not fair. We've supported this company, and they threw us out on the street. We will fight to our last breath.
We've always been here for them. We have always done what they asked us to do. To be treated like this now, it's beyond unfair. They owe us our salaries for 2 months. They have left us out in the cold.
The company's argument for the layoffs is that sales have dropped due to the pandemic. But Bolivia's main workers' union has already denounced that at least 6 different companies with over 200 workers have closed their doors, laying off all employees. Despite the fact a government decree prohibits these very acts during the health emergency.
Progressive leaders and intellectuals of the Puebla group held a virtual meeting on Friday to discuss the social and political crisis in Colombia. The participants evaluated the state of the Colombian peace process and analyzed the ongoing armed conflict, which has killed nearly 100 social leaders this year alone. The Puebla group also reviewed the health crisis sparked by the COVID-19 pandemic. Former President of Colombia, Ernesto Samper, stressed that progressive sectors in the country are seeking to build an agenda that addresses both the health crisis and the wider socioeconomic and political crisis in Colombia. Former Brazilian President Luis Inácio Lula da Silva called on the Puebla group to promote a meeting with the UN in order to discuss the COVID-19 pandemic in the region.
There is no meeting, no call from other countries to insist and take on the responsibility to continue contributing with the World Health Organization, which is the organization that leads the rest of the world. I know we as the Puebla group should insist that the Secretary General of the UN holds a meeting with the group to discuss coronavirus, in order to discuss the pandemic with more seriousness. Bolsonaro has no right to present cures. He has no right to make up remedies. He has no right to demand people to go back to work without the necessary preventive measures.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again in a minute. Welcome back to From the South. More news now. Brazil's health minister Nelson Teich has resigned in the midst of the coronavirus crisis after serving for less than a month. Our correspondent Brian Muir has more.
After less than 1 month on the job, Brazil's replacement national health minister, Nelson Teich, has just resigned from his position. Now, this is the second health minister who's worked with far-right President Jair Bolsonaro since the coronavirus pandemic began. The first minister, Luis Mandela, resigned with a 76% approval rate from the population because of his hard-headed pushing back against Bolsonaro's irresponsible demands that the population ignore the state governors and ignore the quarantine recommendations, the self-isolation recommendations. Nelson Teich had no public health experience. He was a private clinic owner from Rio de Janeiro's posh South Side, who was apparently a friend of the Bolsonaros for many years. During his short tenure in the health ministry, he butchered funding for ventilator purchases. He canceled an order of 15,000 ventilator purchases from China. And he also cut spending on personal protective equipment for medical professionals. Now, the rumors are that his resignation is the result of an argument he had with the president over the use of chloroquine, which the president has been pushing very hard despite a lack of medical evidence that it's very effective in fighting the virus. As it turns out, Apsen, the Brazilian pharmaceutical company which produces the most chloroquine in Brazil, is owned by Renato Spelacci, who was one of the biggest campaign donors to the Bolsonaro campaign in 2018. Most people expect that Teich's replacement will be yet another Brazilian military general.
A community organization in Sao Paulo, Brazil, has started a campaign to fight COVID-19 in the city's favelas, where social distancing is difficult to comply with. Brian Muir has the story for us.
In Complexo da Mare, a neighborhood made up of 16 connected favelas in Rio de Janeiro's north side, a community organization has started a campaign against coronavirus.
The goal of this campaign is very clear. It's designed to last for 3 months and was made based on a database we created from data from our neighborhood census on the 6,000 most vulnerable families in our community.
In situations where social distancing is difficult, such as favelas, Brazilian health officials recommend that people get enough calories per day and frequently wash their hands. So working with governmental and private donors, Regis has started distributing groceries and hygiene items to 6,000 families in Mare.
Other institutions are helping us with the sanitization procedures, which is essential. So we are donating high-quality food that is sanitized, so that we can protect the health of the volunteers and the people who are receiving these donations.
It is hoped that this, coupled with constant communications with residents on the need to wear masks and take other precautionary measures, will reduce transmission in this impoverished neighborhood of 140,000 people. Brian Muir, Telesur, São Paulo.
Moving on, this week, Cuba started a zero prevalence study of COVID-19, which will allow for precise estimates of the population's current infection rates. Experts say this will greatly help monitor how the pandemic is evolving and to identify the main risk still present.
In central Havana, state officials have no time to rest. The health ministry has decided to take the fight to the pandemic, carrying out real-time PCR testing in as many neighborhoods as possible, looking for carriers of COVID-19 that haven't shown any symptoms.
This strategy is of utmost importance because it will allow us to further prevent possible infections.
For this study, the first of its kind in Latin America and the Caribbean, over 4,000 people were chosen at random across 17 municipalities. In this way, experts will be able to discover asymptomatic cases. For this study over the last 6 weeks, a novel system was developed to diagnose COVID-19.
The importance of this test is that it allows us to give our national health system a useful tool to determine what groups within the population have been exposed to the coronavirus and which haven't. In this way, we will be able to take all the necessary measures to stop the spread of the infection.
This technology has been developed in our research centers since 1987. When our center was first founded, it allows for massive screening of entire population.
Currently, over 10 countries in Latin America are using this technology developed in Cuba. It allows for early diagnosis of a number of illnesses, for epidemiological surveillance, and to determine the possibility for blood and organ transplants.
We have over 300 laboratories in Latin America that have allowed for the study of over 48 million children and over 100 million tests. This is how we develop science to help our people for the sake of our people's health and that of our sister nations.
The scientific community, health professionals, and the people all working towards a common goal, stopping the novel coronavirus.
The South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has toured coronavirus health facilities ahead of the deployment of Cuban doctors. A team of 217 Cuban medical doctors are ready to be deployed in the health facilities after completing the quarantine period. They arrived in South Africa last month to bolster local healthcare workers in their efforts to flatten the coronavirus infection curve.
I called the Cuban president and asked him to send us their top specialists to come to South Africa. They are now here. Dr. Mkhize has received them, and he's the one who's deploying them throughout the country. And I'm really pleased with the plan that the minister has laid out to have them deployed to all the provinces of our country.
The African National Congress Secretary General Elias Sekagobe Magashule has commended the solidarity and contribution of Cuba to the liberation struggle of African nations. He spoke during the Human Solidarity and Internationalism lecture held in South Africa today.
Today, comrades, we use the opportunity of this platform to share ideas about the significance of human solidarity and internationalism and the role of the Cuban Revolution in the history of our struggle against imperialism and colonialism. President Nelson Mandela said the following words of gratitude, thanking the contribution of the Cuban Revolution towards human solidarity and internationalism. I quote Nelson Mandela, "We come here with great humility. We come here with great emotion. We come here with a sense of great debt that is owed to the people of Cuba. What other country can point to a record of greater selflessness than Cuba has displayed in its relations with Africa?"
Business and social life has resumed in the Senegalese capital, Dakar, as the lockdown is lifted. The country's president, Macky Sall, relaxed most of the measures put in place against COVID-19 and allowed places of worship to open. He also allowed markets 6 days to operate, except for 1 day per week when they have to be closed for disinfection and sanitizing. Senegal reported 121 new confirmed cases of COVID-19, bringing the total in the country to 2,310. Kenya has started rolling out a mass testing exercises for coronavirus on truck drivers. The operation is being conducted at Kenya's border with Uganda and comes after an increase of cases in truck drivers who have remained operating during the lockdown between the countries. Kenya has less than 1,000 cases and 42 people have so far died from the virus, while Uganda remains one of the African countries less affected with only 160 cases.
Then I can comfortably say that we are able to test approximately 5,000 samples within a day, right here in Kemrialupe.
It's good to test as truck drivers because we mix with many and meet various types of people along the way.
Migrant workers from Ethiopia who survived after being crammed inside a freight container in the northwestern Mozambican province of Titi at the end of March have been able to return home. 64 people were found dead inside the blue cargo container when the truck carrying it was stopped at a weight bridge. It had been traveling from Malawi to Mozambique. 14 people survived. The truck driver and his assistant were arrested by police.
I am very grateful to be back in Ethiopia. I'm very happy to be back in my country. I will never have this idea again. If people want to travel, I advise them not to.
It was very hot inside, like a fire burning. We couldn't breathe in and out.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this. Welcome back to From the South. More news now. Earlier, we spoke to independent journalist John McAvoy on his reporting, which exposes a secretive unit set up by the British government's Foreign Office that aims to support the overthrow of the Venezuelan government. We discussed what the most tangible support for the coup efforts of Washington and Juan Guaido looked like coming from the British state.
Well, going as far back as 2008, the Tony Blair government was aggressively lobbying for Guatemala to have a seat on the UN Security Council in order that they called it ghastly Venezuela, would not acquire a seat. So this kind of intervention in Venezuelan politics from the British state actually goes back more than a decade. However, more recently, in January 2019, the Foreign Office urged the Bank of England to freeze over $1 billion worth of Venezuelan gold. Obviously, this was at a time of a severe economic crisis in Venezuela. Later, and as the months have gone by, Great Britain's recognition of Juan Guaido, along with many other European countries, allows the United States not to work unilaterally, and so its activities in Venezuela look a little less absurd/monstrous. Given that it has a coalition of the willing behind it, as it did in Iraq. So these are the various ways in which the British government has been trying to destabilize Venezuela, has been offering its kind of diplomatic and economic support to Juan Guaido. However, you asked any tangible evidence if they're connected to the recent U.S. mercenary incursion. I mean, there's no tangible evidence that there's any British connection per se. But I mean, the issue is the British government welcomed somebody, the highest echelons of the British government welcomed Juan Guaido into Parliament at a time when he was organising what can only be described, or what can be described by many people as a terrorist incursion into Venezuela, and that's quite an important point to make.
Moving on, migrants flocking from India amid the lockdown have been faced with an array of challenges as they walk long distances going back to their homes. Almost 200 of them are reported to have died along the way as a result of accidents and starvation. Millions of the migrants decided to return back to their homes after losing jobs due to the COVID-19 lockdown imposed by the Indian government.
We will die anyway, but dying there is better than dying here. We're just praying that our children remain safe and will reach our village. If we make it to the village, we will survive somehow. Here there is no chance. We will die for sure.
Pakistan is faced with serious food shortages after desert locusts have invaded the country's farms. Farmers are struggling to combat the worst locust plague in nearly 3 decades and have already destroyed hectares of crops, causing food prices to rise. A team of Chinese experts has arrived in Pakistan to help combat the locust. The insects have since caused havoc in East Africa and India before they were on their way to Pakistan.
Locusts have caused havoc on our hard work, which we did throughout the year. They've eaten and left us empty-handed. The landlord farmers are also in trouble.
The World Health Organization has announced it is probing any possible COVID-19 link to a rare inflammatory illness that has killed more than 100 children in Europe and the United States.
Reports from Europe and North America have described a small number of children being admitted to intensive care units with a multi-system inflammatory condition with some features similar to Kawasaki's disease and toxic shock syndrome. Initial reports hypothesize that this syndrome may be related to COVID-19. It's critical to urgently and carefully characterize this clinical syndrome to understand causality and to describe treatment interventions.
And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And be sure to follow us on social media as well, and be sure to follow me on Twitter at @ebravo Telesur. For Telesur English, I am Stefania Bravo. Until next time.